Saint Peter Claver was born on June 26, 1580, in the small village of Verdú in Catalonia, Spain, into a family of devout and prosperous farmers. From his earliest years he was nurtured in the living Catholic faith, and within the atmosphere of his home he received a heart that longed to seek the will of God. As he entered youth, Peter Claver pursued studies at the University of Barcelona. There he distinguished himself not only for his keen intellect, but also for the purity and integrity of his life. In the midst of his dedicated years of study, he kept the habit of writing his spiritual reflections in a private notebook. In that very notebook, which has been preserved, he once recorded a profound resolution: "I must dedicate my life to God, until death, as a slave." These words were not a formal vow, but rather a voice rising from the depths of his soul, expressing a desire for complete consecration, humble and wholly surrendered to Christ the Lord. In the year 1602, at the age of 20, Peter Claver chose to follow the call he had long carried in his heart by entering the Society of Jesus at Tarragona. The years of formation in the novitiate further deepened his zeal and strengthened his resolve. He was then sent to Mallorca to continue his studies in philosophy, and it was there that a decisive encounter awaited him. He came to know Saint Alphonsus Rodriguez, the humble Jesuit lay brother who served as porter of the college, a man already renowned for his holiness and for the gift of spiritual insight. This elder brother, filled with wisdom born of prayer, repeatedly counseled him with certainty that it was God's will for Peter Claver to devote his life entirely to the missions in the New World. Those words, spoken from a heart attuned to God, became a living flame within Claver's soul, impressing themselves deeply upon him and gradually shaping the entire direction of his vocation. In 1610, after completing his initial formation in the Society, Peter Claver left his homeland of Spain to embark on a journey from which he would never return. He set foot in Cartagena, in the new kingdom of Granada, today's Colombia, a bustling port that was at the same time the largest center of the slave trade in the Caribbean. There he continued his theological studies in Tunja and Bogotá. During this period, he came under the profound influence of Father Alonso de Sandoval, a fellow Jesuit who had devoted more than 40 years of his life to ministering to Africans brought in chains. Sandoval not only served them with tireless charity, but also immersed himself in their customs, languages, and beliefs, so deeply that in 1627 he published a book describing in detail the lives and traditions of these peoples. His dedication and example became a living school for Peter Claver, opening before him a clear path and impressing upon him that his own life must be bound to those who were most abandoned. After 6 years of formation, in 1616, Peter Claver was ordained a priest in Cartagena, and from that moment his vocation was sealed to the destiny of the African slaves arriving at that port. At the dawn of the 17th century, Cartagena had become the greatest center of the slave trade in the Caribbean. Each year, nearly 10,000 Africans were brought there after long and brutal crossings of the Atlantic, journeys in which as many as a third were believed to perish at sea. The native peoples were judged too fragile for the heavy toil of the gold and silver mines, and so the mine owners and merchants turned instead to import men and women from Angola and Congo. They were purchased in their homelands for a pittance and resold in the Americas at many times the price, treated as mere commodities in a marketplace of grave injustice. Yet centuries earlier, Pope Paul III, through the bull Sublimis Deus of 1537, had already affirmed the inviolable dignity of every human person. Pope Urban VIII repeated the prohibition, and later Pope Pius IX would call the trade in slaves the most dreadful of crimes. Still, the evil commerce continued, swelling with enormous profits and spreading its stain, until Cartagena itself stood as a wound upon the history of humanity. In 1622, on the day of his solemn profession in the Society of Jesus, Peter Claver signed the document with a line in Latin that history has preserved. Petrus Claver, Ethiopium semper servus. Peter Claver, servant of the Africans forever. This was not a formal vow required by the rule of the society, nor a legal obligation, but a deeply personal declaration that sprang from a soul entirely imbued with the call to serve. In those few words, Claver expressed the whole course of his life. From that moment forward, he belonged wholly to God, offering himself to the most afflicted, to the black slaves who were despised, cruelly treated, and stripped of their dignity. That act of consecration became the mark of his 40 years of ministry and the guiding light of all his works, so that history remembers him not only as a Jesuit priest, but as the slave of the slaves. Throughout his ministry, St. Peter Claver chose a path distinct from that of his mentor, Father Alonso de Sandoval. While Sandoval often went out to the places where the slaves labored in order to share their burdens and console them, Claver directed his steps to the very harbor, to the ships that carried the newly arrived captives in their misery. Whenever a vessel filled with slaves entered the port of Cartagena, one figure was seen moving differently through the crowd. It was Peter Claver, the Jesuit priest, who did not hesitate to push past merchants and onlookers and descend straight into the dark holds where human bodies lay broken. In the foul air heavy with sickness and fear, he knelt beside those on the verge of death, dressing their wounds, lifting them with his hands, offering them a morsel of food or a sip of water. The slave traders turned away with scorn, considering such care useless, but the trembling captives looked upon him with indescribable gratitude. To them, the priest's hand was the very hand of God, reaching into the depth of their suffering to remind them that even in chains they were still loved and still recognized as human beings. He did not shrink from entering those stifling holds where men and women were packed like animals, bringing with him what they most desperately needed: medicine for the sick, bread and citrus for the exhausted, water for the parched, and above all, the mercy of his presence. He often carried small sacks of medicine, fruit, wine, and bread, distributing them one by one to the shackled and wasted as though they were treasures. When he bent down to give a piece of bread or a drop of water, he gave more than nourishment. He gave a message that reached the heart. With tender hands more eloquent than words, Claver wanted them to know, "You are loved." This detail, preserved in hagiographic tradition, though not in official documents, reflects the deep impression of his charity. Through such gestures, those who had thought themselves stripped of all dignity suddenly awakened, as though through his touch they felt God himself embrace them. With the help of interpreters and even simple painted images, Claver taught the basic truths of the faith to the slaves who had just set foot on this foreign land. He wanted them to understand that, no matter the chains that bound them, God still looked upon them as his beloved children. Alongside his catechesis, there arose a tradition passed down among the people through generations, that his cloak, when placed over anyone, brought health and healing. Though this remains only a legend, not recorded in official documents, it reflects the deep trust that the people had in his charity and holiness. To them, Claver was not only a tireless priest, but a living sign of the mercy of God, touching the wounds of both body and soul. It is often said that during the 40 years of his ministry, Claver baptized around 300,000 slaves. This figure is not an exact statistic, but a tradition handed down to show the extraordinary reach of his mission. What is certain is that once he baptized them, Claver regarded them truly as brothers and sisters in Christ, and he never ceased to demand that their dignity be respected. When the season of ships grew quiet, he would travel through the plantations to visit and instruct, and he consistently chose to lodge with the slaves rather than accept the accommodations prepared for him by wealthy owners. On these journeys, he never accepted the hospitality of the masters, even when they offered him comfortable rooms. Instead, he insisted on sharing the same quarters as the slaves, sleeping on worn mats, eating their meager meals, and even sharing the odor of bodies weary from field labor. For him, this was not merely a gesture of humility, but a way to ensure that they never felt abandoned. His quiet presence among them planted a deep consolation in their hearts, that in a world of oppression, there was still someone who freely chose to live as they did, to affirm that their human dignity could never be lost. Claver did not confine his care only to those in chains. He also preached to sailors, merchants, and even to Muslims and Protestants who came through Cartagena. He visited prisoners awaiting execution and made frequent journeys to hospitals to tend to the sick. When he entered the dark cells, he carried with him not only words of comfort, but the warmth of his human presence. He knelt beside the condemned, listened to their final confessions, granted absolution, and placed the crucifix in their hands for them to hold tightly in their last hours. He abandoned no one, not even those whom society counted as worthless criminals. To Claver, they too were children of God, needing strength to depart this life in peace. Some, receiving the gentleness of his gaze and touch, broke down in tears like children, feeling for the first time that they were forgiven and loved. These silent farewells in the prisons led the people of Cartagena to see him as a living conscience, a shepherd who sought out even the lost sheep until the very end. By his tireless perseverance, he became the conscience of the city itself, so that the people gave him a simple yet shining title, the Apostle of Cartagena. In the final 4 years of his life, St. Peter Claver was struck by a grave illness that slowly drained his strength, leaving him bedridden and unable to continue the visits and ministries that had defined his decades of service. A former slave was hired to care for him, but instead of showing kindness, the man mistreated him and at times even left him hungry. Claver bore this suffering in silence, without complaint, as though he were uniting it with the passion of Christ, accepting it as a way of making reparation for his own sins. On September 8, 1654, in Cartagena, the saint was called home to God, on the very feast of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. His liturgical feast would later be fixed on September 9th. When news of his death spread, crowds filled the small room where he had lived, eager to take even the simplest objects and scraps of cloth as precious relics. Strikingly, the very authorities of Cartagena, who had once considered him troublesome for his steadfast defense of the enslaved, now took charge of arranging a solemn public funeral. He was laid to rest with rare honor, a powerful testimony that his love and silent sacrifices had at last touched the conscience of the entire city. Nearly 2 centuries after his death, the Church formally recognized the sacrifice and love that Peter Claver had given to the slaves. In 1851, Pope Pius IX raised him to the honors of the blessed, and in 1888, Pope Leo XIII solemnly canonized him together with Saint Alphonsus Rodriguez, the spiritual companion of his early Jesuit years. Not stopping there, In 1896, Pope Leo XIII declared him patron of the missions among all African peoples. Today, the saint's body is preserved and venerated in the church that bears his name, San Pedro Claver, in Cartagena, a living witness to a life poured out without rest. Pope Leo XIII himself once spoke words that seem to sum up his legacy. "No life, except that of Christ, has moved me so deeply as the life of Peter Claver." The influence of Saint Peter Claver did not cease with his death, but continued to spread across centuries and continents. His name has been chosen for countless organizations, parishes, schools, and religious congregations as a way of carrying forward his mission of love for the poor and the forgotten. In the United States, the largest Catholic fraternal society of African Americans was founded in Mobile, Alabama, under his patronage. Today, its headquarters are in New Orleans, with branches reaching even to Colombia. In ports throughout the world, the Apostleship of the Sea still embodies his spirit of service to sailors and those who labor upon the waters, drawing direct inspiration from his example. In 1894, Blessed Maria Teresa Ledachowska founded the Missionary Sisters of St. Peter Claver, consecrating her life to uplifting the poor, especially in Africa. Many parishes and schools in the United States, South Africa, Kenya, Belize, and beyond also bear his name, enduring signs of the strength of a life wholly given. In Colombia, the National Congress has chosen September 9th, the day the Church celebrates his feast, as the National Day of Human Rights, a testimony that one humble life lived entirely for others can become a guiding light for an entire people in the defense of human dignity. The undeniable truth is that in an age when slaves were treated as mere commodities, Claver chose to live as their friend, their father, and their brother. He went down into the dark holds of the ships instead of watching from the shore. He chose the cramped quarters of the slaves instead of the guest rooms offered by the masters, and he etched his name into history through a life of total devotion, calling himself the slave of the slaves. This was the source of his strength, a witness that Christian charity is not a theory, but a living commitment that touches the wounds of others. The legacy of St. Peter Claver is a call that transcends time, reminding us that human dignity can never be denied, and that love, when lived to the very end, has the power to transform even the darkest chapters of history. This is why the Church has raised him to the honors of the saints, and why in Colombia his feast has been chosen as the National Day of Human Rights. From a man who freely chose to become a slave, he left to future generations an imperishable lesson, that in humility and service, the dignity of the human person and the light of the gospel are always affirmed, no matter the chains that bind. If the life and witness of St. Peter Claver has moved you, please subscribe to this channel. By joining us, you help keep alive the memory of the saints and the light of the gospel. Let us walk together in faith, inspired by their example.